Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a una nueva edición de su programa Palabra de Mujer, en lo que será la primera parte de una entrevista que le realizaremos a la filósofa política y teórica social Judith Butler, quien ocupa la cátedra Maxine Elliott de Retórica, Literatura Comparada y Estudios de la Mujer en la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Bienvenida, profesora Butler.
Gracias.
En esta entrevista nos estará colaborando la profesora de Lenguas Modernas, Adriana Jiménez, en la traducción. Doctora Butler, usted es reconocida internacionalmente, entre muchas otras cosas, por su producción teórica y activismo político en torno a la violencia de Estado. Uno de sus últimos libros, en particular, hace una crítica al sionismo como forma de gobierno en Israel, retomando autores como Walter Benjamin y Hannah Arendt, toda una tradición judaica en torno a la violencia de Estado. ¿Por qué cree que es importante diferenciar entre sionismo y judaísmo?
That's a good question. Entiendo bien, gracias. Well, I think, first of all, it's important to remember that Zionism is a political movement that started officially in the late 1890s in Europe, and it envisioned a homeland for the Jewish people in the lands of Palestine. But even then, in 1895, there was no recognition that there were people living on that land. It was referred to by Herzl as a land without a people, and the Jewish people were referred to as a people without a land. So it looked like a beautiful vision, and many people were inspired by this vision, especially because there was so much anti-Semitism in Europe, and as we know, in the 20th century, that anti-Semitism only became worse and culminated in the Nazi genocide against the Jews. So in the 1930s and 40s, as more Jews arrived from Europe in Palestine, they confronted the fact that there were Palestinians who had lived on those lands for many years and had property rights to the land as well. And there were several conflicts. And I think there was a very important question that many of the Jewish immigrants had to answer in the 1940s. Would they build a state that was based on the principle of Jewish sovereignty, where the Jews would decide what the state would be, where the Jews would be represented by the state, or would they develop a binational state, which would include the Jewish people and the Palestinians who were already on the land? And I think they made the wrong decision. They decided in 1948 to establish a state on the principles of Jewish sovereignty rather than a binational state in which Jews and non-Jews enjoy equal rights. My sense is that that is a failure of democracy, and that failure began then, and it continued as 700,000, 800,000 Palestinians were in fact expelled from their homes. Now, Zionism is one part of Judaism, but Judaism is, of course, a religion that exceeds Zionism and that has many important ethical and religious values. And one of those values is to respect the sanctity of life. Another one of those values is to treat your neighbor with hospitality. Another one of those values is to learn how to cohabit together, Jew and non-Jew, on the land. Many of those are strong Jewish values, and we could find them both in religious texts and in philosophical texts. My effort has been to recover a Jewish philosophical and ethical tradition that is distinct from Zionism, that prizes equality, that cares about the sanctity of life, and that acknowledges the rights of all refugees.
Usted es reconocida también por su compromiso con las políticas LGBT y los derechos humanos. Israel fue uno de los primeros ejércitos en el mundo en incluir personas gays, lesbianas y trans en su ejército.
Sí.
¿No cree que el precio que pagamos las minorías sexuales por incluirnos dentro de las instituciones sin cuestionarlas es muy alto. ¿Y qué piensas sobre conceptos como homonacionalismo,
Sí.
pinkwashing y toda esta estrategia que utilizan algunos estados como el de Israel para lavar su imagen y presentarse como progresistas y defensores de los derechos humanos?
It's a good question and a difficult dilemma because, in fact, Israel has a very good record on gay, lesbian, trans human rights. It allows for gay parenting. It offers reproductive technology to lesbians very easily. And the gay pride events in Tel Aviv are world famous for being outrageous and joyful. So I cannot condemn that, of course. I am in favor of those rights, and it is quite important. But we have to remember two different political facts. First, there is violence against gay, lesbian, trans people from the right wing in Israel. So there is internal violence. It's not as if all of Israel is agreed on the rights of gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual, intersex people. It's not the case. Secondly, I think we have to ask how the advertisement of Israel as a safe haven for gay people is used to establish a very partial human rights record. It is unfortunate that that it is possible for any state to have an excellent human rights record in some areas and to have an absolutely terrible human rights record in other areas. So when the state of Israel campaigns or produces a kind of advertising machine to construct Israel as a human rights haven, what it does is it effaces the fact that it keeps tens of thousands of Palestinians under indefinite detention in prisons where they have no legal representation, where they are let go only to be re-arrested within weeks. It deflects from the human rights record that it has in relationship to civilian killings in Gaza, which are war crimes. It deflects from its terrible human rights records when it that is made clear in the way in which it denies rights of mobility to people who live in the West Bank. It denies rights of free expression for those who have overt political criticisms of the state, who call for a two-state solution, or who even call for a radical democratic alternative to political Zionism, right? So very often those who ask for equality are considered to be potential terrorists. There are severe restrictions on mobility, free speech. The prison system is appalling, and it does not conform with international norms. And the war crimes against Gaza, the explicit targeted killing of civilians, is unacceptable under any international law. So we have to look at the full picture. I think that's my view.
Okay. En Costa Rica hay un fuerte movimiento conservador religioso que tiene mucho poder institucional, que tiene asiento en la estructura del Estado. Y este movimiento se opone a cualquier forma de reconocimiento en términos de derechos laborales para las personas que ejercen trabajo sexual. Lamentablemente muchas veces su posicionamiento encuentra eco en un feminismo oficial que es de corte abolicionista y ve en la prostitución y en cualquier forma de trabajo sexual una forma de esclavitud. ¿Cuál es su posición respecto a este viejo dilema en el feminismo?
Okay, I think I understood.
Would you like me to?
Yes.
He's asking basically your position in terms of a classical type of feminism that views sex work as slavery and torture. In the context of like Costa Rica, where we have a very strong movement from the right wing sector
Yes.
to abolish sex work,
Yes.
and it's backed up by some of the feminism in this country.
Right. And that right-wing structure is also religious to some degree?
Religious and institutional.
Yes, okay. Well, I belong to that history of the feminist movement that believes that sex work is work, and it should be treated like work. In other words, sex workers should be given safe conditions. Sex workers should be able to engage in that work only on a consensual basis. Sex workers should be given good health care and provided even with retirement benefits. And of course, I am against human trafficking. I am against coercion, but I do not accept the idea that all sex work is coerced. I think that is false. I think that underestimates what women's agency is. It's a certain kind of work. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's long-term, sometimes people go in and out of it. I know sex workers who have said it's much better work than being trapped in an office all day. So I think that we have to make the work conditions for sex work better. That I believe in. And I think we need to oppose human trafficking, and we need to oppose coercion and exploitation within the sex work industry without identifying sex work as coercive or as enslavement or such. We need to be very careful about these distinctions.
Usted se ha preguntado en su obra, en varios de sus libros, ¿qué es la vida? ¿Quién cuenta como valioso y quién no? Y también ha hablado ampliamente sobre la precariedad que constituye lo humano y lo no humano. ¿Qué tratamiento le daría o cómo abordaría la dicotomía humanidad y animalidad? ¿Y consideraría el vegetarianismo una propuesta ética no violenta?
Ajá. Bueno. Okay. Well, let's take the example of war, all right? What does war do? In war, certain populations are targeted. Certain areas are targeted. What is affected by the bombing of certain areas? What is affected by attacks on certain areas? Well, humans suffer, but animals suffer, and the environment suffers. So, for instance, in Iraq, I believe that the United States has produced toxic soil, which means that all living creatures are suffering from living now where their water is polluted and their soil is toxic. I think we need to understand that precarious life can refer to all living processes, and that under conditions of intense pollution or war or the systematic abandonment of agricultural areas, living processes suffer. Living processes have to be supported in order to continue. And that means that natural environments have to be protected. Human and animal creatures have to have access to food and shelter. So I think precarious life is not an anthropocentric concept, although I think it affects humans differently. Right? We should be able to talk about the way in which human populations are affected by precarious conditions, especially when those conditions are produced by the economic system. Especially when some humans become more poor all the time and other humans become more rich all the time. Well, how do we understand those accelerating inequalities? I want us to be able to think about that at the same time that we recognize that human and animal life are connected. The second question that you have about an ethics of nonviolence, I do think that it is important to consider the institutional means by which both animals and humans are inflicted with violence. I don't think we can separate those issues.
En su pensamiento teórico político, interpreto siempre la necesidad de encontrar nuevas formas políticas de izquierda. ¿Se sigue considerando usted una pensadora política y una activista política de izquierda? ¿Y qué vigencia tiene en el marco global de políticas de austeridad y neoliberalismo, donde la desposesión se instituye como un mecanismo institucionalizado y la violencia también?
It's another very good question. I wish I could answer your questions fully. I wish I had an answer to that very important and urgent question. I think right now it is an interesting moment for what we could call the left, because there are popular movements that are moving into government, like as we see in Greece with Syriza, and as we see in Spain with Podemos. And there may be some others that also are in this liminal position. And of course, it raises all kinds of questions. What is lost when a social movement, a popular social movement on the left, becomes part of the state apparatus? What is gained in terms of power and influence? And I think right now we're seeing debates on the so-called left about whether or not we should be entering into state politics at all, or whether the state itself is part, and state violence in particular, is part of the problem. As you know, there's an anarchist left that believes that it's more important to oppose the state and state violence than to become a party or a program within state politics. And there are others who say, no, that is naive. We must enter into state politics in order to fight for economic equality or greater democratization. I take this antagonism to be a constitutive feature of contemporary left politics. I don't think it will be reconciled quickly. I'm not sure it should be reconciled. I think maybe we need that antagonism to stay alive, so that we remember that whoever is in power, whoever is elected, depends on the popular will, and that popular movements need always to stay alive to check state power. So I believe that this is an important antagonism. I don't take sides, but I am interested in the antagonism, and I think it is a productive one.
En Costa Rica, ayer en la disertación que quedaba aquí en la Universidad de Costa Rica, usted hablaba sobre la necesidad de salirse de una concepción de sexualidad centrada y constreñida por lo reproductivo. Costa Rica es uno de los pocos países del mundo que no tiene un marco jurídico que reconozca las técnicas de reproducción asistida, en particular la fertilización in vitro. Sin embargo, cuando uno se acerca a los sectores progresistas, se encuentra que claman por este derecho, por el acceso y la garantización de este derecho, se encuentra con argumentos conservadores ligados a la familia heterosexista y a los roles de maternidad y paternidad tradicionales. ¿Cómo repensar el parentesco más allá de garantizar el acceso a estos derechos?
Okay. And the status of access to reproductive rights in Costa Rica right now is?
There's like 3 countries in the world that don't allow it. In vitro is illegal.
In vitro is illegal right now. And the reasons that are given for keeping in vitro fertilization illegal?
That some of the methods of the technique involve aborting
viable life.
Yes, life.
Okay. Well, of course, there's a local problem, I presume, because there are surely traditional and religious reasons why people in Costa Rica would oppose in vitro fertilization. So if anyone wanted to argue in favor of it, I'm imagining that those debates would have to take place in a local way that took into account what people's concerns are. So I don't want to be a first world North American who comes in and says what the truth is, because I think these political battles do function locally to some degree. They also benefit from international debate and from global consensus. In most places that I know, the debates have had to center on what is life, when does life begin, what is the viability of life, and very often the debates on abortion are linked to the debates on in vitro fertilization. I'm not sure I understand the argument completely, but in vitro fertilization does involve the fertilization of some eggs rather than others. But that is also the case in so-called natural heterosexual intercourse. Some eggs are fertilized and some are not. So there is no reproduction without a principle of selectivity, if you see what I'm saying. I don't mean to belittle the debate, but it is unfortunate. My guess is that in vitro fertilization is frightening for some people because it takes away the centrality of the man to the and the heterosexual act of reproduction to the act of reproduction itself. But it does expand choices for women, and I think that's an important principle to keep in mind.
En días recientes estuvo en México, donde brindó una conferencia en la UNAM y habló sobre la desposesión forzada y la violencia institucionalizada como mecanismo institucionalizado. También en un diálogo reciente con una política, con una teórica e intelectual griega, habla, digamos, sobre las posibilidades del reconocimiento del sujeto capaz de agencia, aún y gracias a la desposesión. ¿Cómo hacer este vínculo entre agencia y desposesión? Entre resistencia y creación y desposesión forzada.
Okay, you can give that to me again.
He is wanting you to elaborate a little on the relationship between forced dispossession and agency.
I see.
In terms of like resistance and creativity in face of dispossession.
I see. Well, I think that in the context of that particular conferencia, I was trying to bring attention to the fact that many people who are in exceedingly vulnerable positions or in exceedingly precarious positions nevertheless do find ways of mobilizing. And they very often find ways of mobilizing that are outside of state or institutional mechanisms. One of the problems with the way that vulnerability is sometimes discussed is that an entire population is called a vulnerable population. When a vulnerable population is identified within human rights discourse, that usually implies that there is an obligation on the part of a paternalistic organization, either a state authority or an international authority, to protect the vulnerable population, at which point the field of power looks like this. There are those who are vulnerable and there are those with the power to protect them. What's missing from the picture is that the vulnerable also have their own powers. Sometimes effective powers, sometimes not effective powers. But when we look to see what happens in the massive precarity demonstrations in Chile, when the students emerged on the street to demand their right to a free or affordable education, or in the UK or in Rome or in any number of places where economic dispossession is the norm. All of these anti-austerity or precarity demonstrations involve those who are affected, who are vulnerable, who are suffering, coming together, gathering, and also resisting. So it's not as if they overcome their vulnerability to resist. They are vulnerable and they are resisting, and it's both. Now, in Mexico, it's very clear that, the students in Ayotzinapa, they were very vulnerable when they gathered. They knew they were vulnerable. There's no doubt about that. They did not know they would die. But there's a fear of gathering and protesting in the region of Guerrero. Everybody knows that. And there's a fear of gathering and protesting in Mexico City as well. One is subject to police power. One is subject to violence. And the question is, how is it that people who know that they are in an exposed and vulnerable situation still resist? And I want to say that it is important to keep in mind that the vulnerable can resist. And one of the problems with being extremely poor or radically dispossessed is that you can become hopeless about acting at all. But I do believe that that means that it is most important to remind ourselves and each other that vulnerability is not the opposite of action. It can be brought into action, it can be mobilized in forms of resistance. And this happens most effectively when there are large gatherings, when the gatherings become larger and larger, and where the networks of solidarity are expanding.
Agradecerle por la entrevista en nombre de Palabra de Mujer y por la oportunidad de venir aquí a Costa Rica, y a Adriana por toda la ayuda con la traducción. Y de esta forma llegamos a esta edición de Palabra de Mujer. Les invito a continuar con la segunda parte de esta entrevista, a acompañarnos en ella.
¿Considera usted que posee una metodología determinada a su trabajo? ¿Hay un procedimiento metodológico que se replique a lo largo de su obra?
Well, it is true, I probably do not have a methodology. I don't know if I'm against methodology. I think rather that I work between philosophy and literary theory, and what I bring from literary theory is a reading practice. So for me it is more important to find a reading practice that works with a particular text or with a particular cultural set of objects or a political institution. How to read is my question, not what method to use. I think some people who use methods decide on their method and then they apply it to their object, but I feel like that's insensitive to the object. In a way, you have to be more open to the question of what kind of reading needs to happen in relationship to this problem. What is the dominant discourse? How is it constructing the object? How do I read how the dominant discourse works? What does it exclude? What does it produce? So I think that for me, I'm constantly reading dominant discourses and seeing how they construct their objects and wondering how we might reread those practices so that we can construe the world a bit differently.
Esto es particularmente notorio en sus aproximaciones a la filosofía. por ejemplo, su lectura de Hegel o su lectura de Freud, por ejemplo. ¿Cree usted que hacer ese tipo de lecturas es necesario para que la filosofía siga siendo un discurso vigente, importante, socialmente hablando?
Sometimes the work I do, the readings I provide of philosophical texts, even classic texts like the Hegelian ones, have some relationship to social and political reality in our time. Sometimes not. Sometimes not at all. Sometimes I just love being inside the philosophical text and working with a problem. If it resonates with something contemporary, great. If it doesn't, it's okay with me. Not all of my life is about bringing philosophy to bear on social and political events. Sometimes I'm working on philosophy, sometimes I'm working on literary texts or films without immediately making that connection. So I do not seek to be continuous or integrated as a thinker in that way.
Y con respecto a la escritura, usted no se refiere mucho al acto de la escritura. Podría uno suponer que en su escritura el cuerpo tiene una importancia, una relevancia particular, pero ¿cómo entiende el acto de escritura? ¿Qué podría decir sobre el acto de escribir teoría?
You know, let me give you a roundabout way of answering. We could ask the question, why would people read Hegel now? Why would people read Freud now? These are old texts written by men who are gone. Why return to those old texts? But I think, in fact, those texts can live in the present, depending on the kind of reading that we give them. In other words, we read now according to protocols of reading that are new. They've been developed perhaps through post-structuralism, perhaps through other theoretical operations. We learn how to read in new ways. The question is, how can Hegel be made new, or how can Hegel be made living for us now? How can Freud be made living for us now? So, for instance, there are queer readings of Freud. I think of my friend Lee Edelman. He has beautiful queer readings of Freud, right? Now they're not historically correct in the sense that Freud would not have accepted what Lee Edelman says, but that's okay. We don't need Freud to accept. We don't even need the traditional Freudians to accept. We need to see what is useful, what can be animated in our present lives, given how we think now, how we read now. So reading is a way of reanimating texts for the present. And for me, that's extremely important. How can a text be made living for us now? You ask about the body. There are some feminists who believe we need to write in an embodied way, expressing our desire, letting the body reveal itself in language. I don't know anything about that. I'm sorry, I'm not. When they were handing out the feminine essence, I was in the wrong line. Okay, I don't know if you understand my joke, but I mean, I think I have an embodied way of writing, but people don't recognize that as embodied. Why? Because probably it's not a traditionally feminine one. That means they need to think a little bit more about what the body might be or what its possibilities are. I do think that there are ways of writing and ways of doing philosophy that believe or that take as a premise that we abstract from the body and occupy a position of pure mind. And I think that's a dangerous position because it involves a disavowal of the very conditions of our living. So I suppose one question I have is whether there's a way of reading that does not disembody the living conditions of embodiment.
Quiero hacerle algunas preguntas más sobre el tema de lo corporal. Este concepto de la vulnerabilidad, ¿cree usted que podría tener más resonancia en países periféricos latinoamericanos que en países metropolitanos? ¿Cree que adaptar esa teoría de la vulnerabilidad o esa discusión sobre la vulnerabilidad puede enriquecer su teoría si se la piensa desde los países periféricos?
Okay. Do you want to try to?
To what extent thinking about your concept of vulnerability would be affected by applying them from the periphery in terms of peripheral countries?
Yes.
Instead of first world countries?
Yes. Well, let us think a little bit about the periphery, because as you know, there is a periphery of the United States, for instance. There are the undocumented. The entire border with Mexico is the periphery. It's not the Beltway. It's not Washington, D.C. If we think about, one question is whether the periphery is always outside the United States, or whether it's also inside as well. Because we can ask what are the solidarities among Native peoples in Canada, in the United States, and in Central and South America. What is the relationship of indigeneity among all those people in the Americas who are on the periphery of urban and metropolitan life, or the political centers of politics? Similarly, in Europe, we can think about the borders there, and people who are in refugee camps, for instance, in Italy or Greece, or in North Africa, or even in the north of France. They are exceedingly vulnerable, and they are having to think about how best to gain some enfranchisement, some mobility, some citizenship. So I think the periphery happens everywhere. Everywhere where global capitalism is functioning, everywhere where major state powers are in complicity with global capitalism, there is a periphery that is always being reproduced. We can find it in the barracas, we can find it in the barrios, we can find it in the ghettos, we can find it on the borders. So this is extremely important for us to think about. Thai labor, laborers in Thailand, laborers in China, they are all suffering extreme vulnerability and precarity. So in my mind, I don't want to stay with a simple geopolitical map where we think we know where power is here and it's not here. Power and powerlessness are being reproduced in different ways across the globe, and we need a more mobile map of power in order to chart that. I would be very unhappy if I developed an idea of vulnerability which was implicitly first world and tried to impose it on the rest of the world. I don't think so. I think what I'm trying to do is track various movements of the precarious throughout the world and learn from their activism, from their forms of solidarity, to develop this concept. I try to subordinate myself to those movements. It's true that theoretically something of my own formation and orientation and North American bias is no doubt at work, but I try to check that when I can.
Estamos en la segunda parte de esta entrevista con la profesora Judith Butler. Contamos con la presencia de Adriana, nuestra traductora. Vamos a continuar con las preguntas. Quería preguntar en este mismo sentido del problema del cuerpo y la vulnerabilidad, ¿hasta qué punto su explicación acerca de la emergencia del sujeto, a partir de su lectura de Althusser, Hegel, da cuenta de la emergencia de un sujeto que podría eventualmente traslaparse con el concepto de individualidad? En otras palabras, ¿cómo dar cuenta desde ese marco de la emergencia de los sujetos entendidos como colectivos?
Okay, good question. In my early work, when I spoke about the subject, many people assumed I was simply talking about the individual. But in fact, when I thought about the subject of gender, I'm imagining a social norm that affects many people. So it can't be reduced to this person, nor can it be reduced to that person. It's more like an interpolation in the Althusserian sense that affects any number of people, and where the responses to the interpolation are quite different, right? It's a girl upon birth, child is born. It's a girl is the first moment of producing this gendered subject. But that gendered subject can end up not wanting to be a girl, or being the wrong kind of girl, or interpreting what we may call girlness in any number of ways. So although the interpolation is somewhat forcible, even obligatory, the hospital makes you put it down, the law makes you put it down. Usually the law does. There are some laws that allow for some variation. The reaction to the interpolation produces cultural diversity, gender diversity. But still, the question is whether performative acts, that is to say the acts by which we reinterpret and re-embody gender, are those which individuals perform. And I want to say yes to some degree, but it's very rare that any of us perform a gender in isolation. In other words, we perform with others, we perform for others. There's a social scene that makes the performance possible. And we usually are citing or referring to others who have preceded us and opened the way for us. Sometimes we feel like we are on a frontier, in a wild, uncharted region, like, is anyone else in the world like me? But when we find the other people who might be, or at least who recognize us, those are very important moments of solidarity. And that's where communities can be articulated that support transgender, that support butch, femme, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, intersex people, bisexual people, very often having to figure out who can recognize me, where am I safe, where am I understood, you know. So, you know, I do think there's a social conception at work. It is true that in recent years I've become interested in the work of Hannah Arendt, precisely because she also has a performative idea of acting. In other words, we act, and in acting produce a new reality. But for her, that kind of action is always plural. It presupposes a plurality. And we have to be acting in concert in order to produce social and political effects in the world. So no one really acts alone, according to Hannah Arendt. To act at all means to act in concert, which means we are always plural, we are always social, we are always, in fact, potentially political when we act in concert. And this struck me as an important way of thinking, and it offered a collective way. She would not use the word collective because she had this terrible allergy to Marxism. I'm happy to use the word collective, but I think she potentially gives us a collective subject of the performative and political act. So that has shifted my position in some ways.
Ayer, una niña de 13 años,
Sí.
Soad Nicole Han Bustillo, de 13 años,
Sí.
apareció muerta y tirada en las calles, en una de las calles en Honduras, por
Sí.
protestar como parte de un movimiento en contra de algunas políticas del gobierno hondureño. Hay una tensión en ese sentido entre la crítica, el cuerpo crítico que sale a la calle y se empodera de sí mismo, y la amenaza que supone la posibilidad de muerte. ¿Cómo pensar esa tensión para que los cuerpos críticos puedan seguir postulando socialmente sus críticas.
Well, of course, there is the pure horror at this event, right? I mean, it is horrifying that a 13-year-old girl who dares to express her political views about the government or about the leader of the government should be killed for her views, for her bravery, for her articulation, that she should have to pay for with her life for speaking the truth as she understands it. So my first response, of course, is horror. And then I want to say this. What is dangerous is when people lose the sense of horror. When they say, oh, yes, that's Honduras, or yes, that happens, or she shouldn't have spoken, maybe she deserved it, what could we do? Right? There are many ways of making horrific killing normal. Right? And I saw this in Mexico, where I was visiting recently. You know, in the newspapers, some of the local people asked about the disappearance of the 43 students, now presumed dead. What do you think? Well, they had it coming, or they brought it on themselves. When this kind of discourse becomes ordinary, when it becomes normalized, when it becomes accepted in the newspaper, the media, everyday life, that means we've lost our sense of horror. We refuse the sense of horror. So, on the one hand, I really believe that one has to keep the sense of horror alive. How do you do that? There's a risk. There's the sensationalist media. Oh, girl killed, right? And it becomes sensationalist event. There's no analysis. There's no understanding why. There's no moral objection. There's just horrified fascination. So we want our horror to lead to ethical and political analysis and intervention, but we don't want it to become sensationalized horror, right? It seems to me that's a very important distinction. I guess I would also just say the following. You know, I've written on the play of Sophocles, Antigone, and that play starts with Creon, the king, leaving the body of Polynices, his nephew, on the ground, unburied, just exposed on the street. Why does he do that? Well, he doesn't believe that this nephew who opposed him should have a proper burial. But also, what is he doing politically? He's making a spectacle of the deaf. He's showing everyone else around him that if you defy me, if you are not loyal to me, this is what will happen to you. So what have they done with this 13-year-old girl? They have produced her body as a spectacle that is meant to instill terror in everyone, right? So, and once that happens, once people become effectively terrorized, they will not be able to move forward, they will not be able to speak, they will not be able to say politically what they think is true. They are denied the capacity to exercise the right of speech, the right to free speech, which is a fundamental democratic right. So, on the one hand, we have the brutal and horrifying killing of a young girl. On the other hand, we have an attack on democracy.
Una última pregunta.
Sí.
¿Creo posible reconocer dos flancos de trabajo en su obra? Una primera etapa que está relacionada con la discusión de la violencia de género, más vinculada a la teoría queer, y un segundo momento en el que se interesa por temas geopolíticos, de violencia de Estado. ¿Hacia dónde va su obra en el futuro? ¿Qué otros tópicos de interés cree que explorará en adelante? ¿Hacia dónde iría su obra?
Well, I don't know. one topic that interests me greatly is public mourning. And I believe that even in my earlier work in gender trouble, género en disputa, I was concerned that there was a general cultural prohibition on mourning the loss of gay lives, especially those who were suffering with HIV or who died from AIDS. So this was 25 years ago in the United States. It still remains true all over the world that there are many unacknowledged deaths from AIDS. It's not as if it's an old phenomenon. But at that time, I was concerned, and I thought there must be public mourning. There must be a way of acknowledging these losses, of claiming that these losses are wrong, of making demands for health care that would stop these deaths from happening. And many of the forms of activism at the time, including ACT UP, were about insisting on public acts of mourning. Queer Nation, ACT UP, both of those, at least in the United States and elsewhere, were very important in that way. I think after 9/11, I became aware that the United States would mourn those who were killed in the terrible 9/11 attacks, but it would never mourn those it kills. It would never mourn the losses of civilians in Iraq. It would never mourn it wouldn't even mourn the non-US citizens who were killed in 9/11, right? So there was a hierarchy of mourning. Who can be mourned publicly, who cannot? Now, so this leads me to a kind of broader question of who can be grieved and who is not grieved, who is taken out of the category of the grievable. And my own view is that all lives should be equally grievable, which means that all lives are equally valuable and all lives should be equally safeguarded and preserved. And we should work for egalitarian social, political, and economic structures where all lives may be considered and treated as equal. I am interested in the fact that very often acts of public mourning are also acts of public protest. So what is this relationship between the act of demanding public recognition for a loss and protesting the violence that brought about the loss? Whether it's state violence, whether it's economic violence, whether it's the violence of the cartel, whether it's the violence of domestic violence, it needs to be named, it needs to be opposed. But I think mourning, naming, and opposing can work together as part of public protest and as part of what we understand as the contemporary tasks of public assembly.
Agradecemos profundamente a la profesora Butler, así como a Adriana, por esta segunda parte de la entrevista del programa Palabra de Mujer. Síganos por la señal del canal 15 y hasta pronto.